Helena tightened her grip on the steering wheel as the old house came into view. The towering oak trees surrounding it cast long shadows in the afternoon light, their twisted branches resembling skeletal fingers against the sky. She took a deep breath. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet place to rebuild her life after the divorce. The house was old, Victorian style, with peeling white paint and ivy crawling up the stone foundation. It had been empty for years, the real estate agent had said, but structurally sound. Helena stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots, the only sound in the stillness. The silence was almost oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She shook off the feeling and started unloading her things. The inside smelled of dust and neglect, but there was something else. A faint metallic scent lingering in the air. Dismissing it, she busied herself unpacking, avoiding the looming door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to the basement. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting golden light through the kitchen window. Helena decided to explore the overgrown backyard before nightfall. The garden was wild, with weeds swallowing the remnants of what must have once been a beautiful space. She knelt to pull at a particularly stubborn root, her fingers sinking into the damp soil. That's when she felt it, a hard, cold object buried beneath. Curious, she dug around it, her nails scraping against rusted metal. A key. It was large, old-fashioned, and heavy in her palm. Its intricate design almost organic, as if the iron had twisted and shaped itself over time. Helena brushed off the dirt, examining it under the dimming light. Why would a key be buried here? A shiver ran down her spine, though the evening air was still warm. That night, she left the key on the kitchen counter and fell into bed, exhaustion pulling her into a deep sleep. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, a soft murmuring, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But as the night stretched on, the sound grew, more distinct, more insistent. And it was coming from the basement. Helena's eyes snapped open. The room was dark save for the dim glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. The whispers had stopped. She exhaled, shaking off the lingering unease. Maybe it had been a dream, just the stress of the move and the exhaustion playing tricks on her. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin, determined to ignore the lingering chill in the air. But then, the sound came again, software muted, coming from beneath the floorboards. Helena bolted upright. Her breath caught in her throat as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. She hesitated, listening. Silence. The old house was settling, that was all. Still, a gnawing unease burrowed into her gut. She grabbed her phone and checked the time, 3:12 a.m. The logical thing to do was go back to sleep, but instead, she found herself padding cautiously down the hallway. The air felt thicker the closer she got to the basement door, a weight pressing against her chest. The house, once merely old and abandoned, now felt occupied. Helena hesitated. The whispers had stopped, but an almost imperceptible hum remained, like something just beyond the edge of hearing. She reached for the door handle. It was cold, too cold. A sudden creak echoed through the hallway. She spun around, heart hammering, her pulse roaring in her ears. The kitchen light flickered. A shadow shifted in the corner of her vision, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. Her gaze fell to the kitchen counter. The key. She had left it lying flat, but now it stood upright on its own. A breath hitched in her throat. That wasn't possible. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, but before she could touch it, the basement door let out a deep, low thud, as if something on the other side had pressed against it. Helena stumbled backward, and for the first time since moving in, she felt it. Something was waiting for her down there. Morning arrived in a sluggish haze. Helena had barely slept, her thoughts tangled in the memory of the whispers, the moving key, and the unnatural cold emanating from the basement door. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the key resting on the countertop. In the daylight, it looked normal, just an old, rusted object, ordinary, but she knew better. A sharp knock at the front door made her jump. She exhaled, shaking off the lingering unease before heading to answer it. An elderly man stood on her porch. His posture was rigid, his weathered face set in a grim expression. "You must be the new owner," he said, his voice rough as gravel. Helena nodded. "That's me." He studied her for a moment before his eyes flickered past her, toward the inside of the house. "I'm Vicente. Live down the road." His gaze darkened. "I don't mean to intrude, but have you heard anything unusual since moving in?" Her stomach clenched. "Like what?" Vicente shifted on his feet. "Voices." A chill prickled at the back of her neck. "Why?" He exhaled heavily. "That house." He trailed off, glancing toward the basement window at the side of the house. "Some doors shouldn't be opened." Helena frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before shaking his head. "Forget it. Just, if you hear something, if anything feels wrong, don't go near the basement." The air around them felt strangely still. Before she could press him for more, he turned, walking back down the porch steps without another word. Helena stood there, watching him disappear down the road. She should have been unnerved, should have taken his warning seriously. Instead, she found herself glancing back at the key on the counter. A thought slithered into her mind unbidden. What does it unlock? That night, the house refused to settle. Helena lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the weight of Vicente's warning pressing on her. She tried to push it aside, tried to rationalize the unease gnawing at her insides, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the key on the counter was waiting for her. The air inside the house felt different now, heavier. Then, just past 3 a.m., the whispers returned, soft at first, like wind through cracked walls, but as the seconds crawled by, they grew clearer, closer. Helena's skin prickled. She sat up, her breath shallow, listening. The sound wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from beneath her. The basement. She forced herself out of bed, moving as if in a trance. The hallway stretched before her, darker than it should have been. A pressure built in her ears, a low hum vibrating through the floorboards. With each step toward the kitchen, the air grew colder. She stopped in front of the basement door. The whispers ceased. A silence followed, thick, expectant. Her fingers brushed the handle. Bang! Something slammed against the other side. Helena staggered backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. The door didn't shake. The house didn't tremble. Whatever had hit it had done so deliberately, controlled. She sucked in a shaky breath, stepping closer again. A deep, resonant creak rumbled through the wood, slow, methodical. The door was moving, number not moving, breathing. She reached for the key on the counter. It was warm now, too warm. Another thud, this one softer, like fingers tracing the wood. Helena's stomach twisted. She wasn't alone. She turned, fumbling for the light switch. The bulb flickered once, twice. Then darkness swallowed the room. And in that instant, in the blackness behind her, she heard it. a voice inches from her ear. "Let me out." Helena's breath hitched. The voice had been right there, right behind her. She spun around, but the darkness was absolute. No shapes, no shadows, just an endless void stretching beyond where the kitchen should be. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then, just as suddenly as the light had died, the bulb flickered back to life. The kitchen was exactly as it had been. The chairs, the counter, the key. The basement door stood closed. But she knew something had been there, had spoken to her. Helena clutched the key so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had to end this. Whatever was happening, whatever was waiting behind that door, she had to face it. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped forward and slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. A hesitation. The air around her had grown still, too still. Her fingers trembled as she turned the key. Click. The sound echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like a whisper of something waking up. The door didn't swing open on its own. It simply sat there, unlocked, as if inviting her in. Helena swallowed hard, grasped the handle, and pushed. The door creaked open, revealing an abyss. The basement should have been visible. Old wooden stairs, concrete walls, maybe the glow of the tiny window near the ceiling. But there was nothing. Just blackness. A smell hit her. Wet earth, rusted metal, something rotten beneath it all. It made her stomach twist. She reached for her phone, flicking on the flashlight. The beam barely penetrated the dark. It was as if the shadows swallowed the light whole. She took a step forward. The wooden floor beneath her creaked in protest. Something moved down there, a shifting, scraping sound. Helena's breath shuddered out of her. Hello. Silence. And then, a hand shot out from the darkness. Cold, skeletal fingers wrapped around her ankle. She screamed, yanking her leg back, stumbling away from the threshold. The grip was impossibly strong, dragging her forward. Her flashlight clattered to the ground, spinning wildly, its beam flashing over a face. No, not a face. A mouth. Wide, gaping, lined with rows of jagged teeth, stretching into the darkness as if it had no end. A voice slithered up from the abyss, echoing inside her skull. "You let me out." With a final violent jerk, Helena tore free, slamming the door shut and locking it. Silence. The key, still in her trembling hand, burned against her palm. But now, she wasn't sure if locking the door had trapped it inside or trapped her out. Helena staggered backward, gasping for breath. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold onto the key. The house around her felt different now, like something had shifted, like the very walls were exhaling after years of holding their breath. The door remained closed, the lock held, but she knew deep in her bones that whatever was down there, it was no longer trapped. A dull ringing filled her ears. Her mind struggled to process what she had seen, the hand, the impossible mouth, the voice inside her head. None of it made sense. It defied reason, defied logic. Yet she had felt it, its grip, its hunger. The silence in the house became unbearable. She needed to get out. Helena grabbed her coat and bolted for the front door. The night air was a shock against her feverish skin. The vast emptiness outside almost dizzying after the suffocating atmosphere of the house. She stumbled down the porch steps, barely noticing the movement in the shadows near the trees. Then, a voice. Not from the basement, from behind her. "You opened it, didn't you?" She whirled around. Vicente stood at the edge of the yard, his face grim, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes weren't just filled with worry, they were filled with fear. Helena opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she explain? What could she even say? Vicente took a cautious step closer. Did you see it? The question made her stomach lurch. She didn't have to answer. Vicente exhaled sharply, running a hand down his weathered face. God help you. Helena's throat tightened. What the hell is in my basement? Vicente hesitated, then spoke slowly. Something that should never have been woken up. Her pulse pounded in her ears. I locked the door again, she said, as if that would make any difference. But Vicente only shook his head. That won't matter. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around them. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent. And in that silence, Helena swore she heard it. A whisper. Not from the basement this time, from the air around them. The whisper slithered through the air, curling around Helena's ears like smoke. It wasn't just a sound, it was inside her head, a murmur of something ancient, something patient. Vicente grabbed her wrist. His grip was firm, grounding her. Listen to me, he said, his voice low. It's not just in the basement anymore. Helena's stomach turned to ice. You don't understand, she whispered. I locked it. It was never about the door, Vicente snapped. His eyes flickered to the house, the way its windows seemed impossibly dark, like gaping mouths. You let it see you, that's all it needed. Her blood ran cold. Then what do I do? Her voice was barely above a breath. Vicente's jaw tensed. Leave, now, before it fully... Bang! A violent tremor rippled through the house. The front door slammed shut on its own. The windows shuddered. The wind around them died instantly, replaced by something much worse. A silence too deep, too deliberate. Helena's breath hitched. She could feel it. Watching, waiting. I can't leave, she realized, dread pooling in her stomach. It won't let me. Vicente's face darkened. Then you have one choice. His fingers dug into her arm. You have to put it back. The words sent a jolt through her. Put it back, she echoed. You mean lock it in again? Vicente shook his head. Number I mean bury it, seal it, this time for good. The key in her pocket suddenly felt heavier. She thought of the whispers, the thing in the dark, the hand that had touched her. She swallowed hard. How? Vicente didn't answer, because before he could, the lights in the house flared violently, then burst, glass shattered. And from within the house, from the deep, endless dark of the basement, a voice that was no longer a whisper spoke her name. Helena. The shadows near the porch began to move. Something was coming. The sound of her name slithered through the night, warping the air around her. It knew her now. Helena turned to run, but the shadows surged forward. The darkness poured from the house, stretching unnaturally, reaching for her. The whispers had returned, but they weren't just sounds anymore. They were hands, fingers, teeth. Vicente shoved her backward. The key, he shouted. She fumbled into her pocket, her fingers burning against the cold metal. It wanted her to drop it. It wanted her weak. The shadows twisted around her legs, a suffocating pressure wrapped around her throat. With the last ounce of strength she had, Helena gritted her teeth and threw the key. It hit the ground, and the moment it did, everything stopped. The air snapped back. The house stood still. The whispers ceased. Helena gasped, stumbling forward. Vicente pulled her up, his grip tight. It's done, he murmured. She turned to the house. The basement door was closed, locked. The key was gone. And from behind the wood, something whispered again. Not pleading, not demanding, just waiting. Because now, Helena was the one keeping it inside. Days passed, then weeks. Helena never entered the basement again. She should have left the house, should have run far away, but something kept her there. A weight, a pull. At night, she still heard it, not as whispers anymore, but as a breath. A slow, rhythmic inhale from beneath the floorboards. She tried to ignore it. She had to ignore it. But the key, she hadn't seen it since that night. It had vanished. Or maybe it was back where it belonged. One evening, a knock came at the door. A new real estate agent stood on her porch, smiling brightly. "Miss Helena, I just wanted to check in. You've been here a while now. Have you thought about selling?" She opened her mouth. She should say yes. Instead, she heard herself say, "No." The agent nodded politely and left. Helena closed the door. The house exhaled around her, and from the basement, beneath layers of stone and wood, something knocked back, waiting, patient, hungry.